Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers. Before the ideas begin, a small request: most of you who watch are not subscribed, and we've noticed this in the numbers, in the gap between views and the audience that stays. We post every single day, we put care into each script, each thought, each question that unfolds in the dark, and if these videos have become part of your nights, if they help you think or drift, or simply exist in that space between waking and sleep, consider subscribing, hitting the like button, turning on notifications so you know when the next one arrives. And if you feel moved to do so, leave a comment, tell us where you're watching from. What philosophical question occupies your mind the most? What idea you return to when everything else falls away? These small gestures matter more than you might think. They allow this work to continue. They allow these ideas to reach others like you, scattered across the world, awake in the quiet hours. Now the introduction ends and the philosophy begins. Every culture sees itself as the centre, as the normal, as the standard against which all others are measured. And this seeing is not perception, but is construction, is not discovery, but is projection, is the way that collective consciousness creates a mirror that reflects not what is there, but what needs to be there. What the culture needs to believe about itself in order to maintain coherence, to justify its existence, to explain why it is the way it is and why that way is right, is natural, is superior to the ways of others. And the superiority is not argued, but is assumed, is the unexamined premise that underlies all cultural self-understanding, is the narcissism that is not individual, but is collective, is the belief that we are special, are chosen, are exceptional, and the exceptional is what every culture believes about itself, is the myth that every nation tells, is the story that makes the culture cohere, that gives members a sense of belonging, of pride, of being part of something that matters. And the mattering is created through the mirror, through the reflection that shows not reality, but idealization. Not what is, but what is imagined. Not the truth, but the narrative. And the narrative is selective, is editing out what does not fit, is highlighting what confirms, is creating the image that the culture wants to see, needs to see, must see in order to function. And the functioning requires this distortion, requires this narcissism, because without it the culture would have to confront its ordinariness, its contingency, its lack of cosmic significance. And the lack is unbearable, is threatening to the collective sense of worth, is undermining the pride that holds the group together. And so the mirror is maintained, is polished, is defended against any reflection that might show something different, something less flattering, something true. And the truth is what the mirror hides, is what the distortion prevents, is what the narcissism protects against. Because the truth is that every culture is just one culture among many, is not special, is not chosen, is not superior, is just a particular arrangement of customs and beliefs and practices that happen to emerge in a particular place at a particular time. And that could have been otherwise. And the otherwise is what cannot be acknowledged, is what the mirror does not show, is what the myth denies, because acknowledging contingency is admitting that the culture is not necessary, is not inevitable, is not the fulfillment of destiny, but is just accident, just history, just the result of forces that have nothing to do with the culture's self-understanding. And the self-understanding is what the mirror creates, is what the myth provides, is the story that makes the culture make sense, that explains why things are the way they are, that justifies the structures, the hierarchies, the inequalities that characterize every culture. And the justification is necessary, is required, is what prevents revolution, what maintains order, what ensures that those who benefit from the arrangement continue to benefit, and those who suffer continue to accept their suffering as natural, as deserved, as the way things must be. And the must is the mythology, is the claim to necessity, is the insistence that this culture, this arrangement, this way of being is not just one way, but is the way, is the correct way, is the superior way. And the superiority is demonstrated through comparison, through the creation of the other, through the projection onto outsiders of everything that the culture rejects in itself, everything that threatens the idealized image, everything that the mirror cannot reflect without shattering. And the shattering is what must be prevented, is what the other makes possible by absorbing all the negativity, all the qualities that the culture denies having, all the characteristics that are incompatible with the myth. And the incompatible is projected outward, is placed onto foreigners, onto enemies, onto those who are different. And the difference is constructed, is exaggerated, is made to seem absolute when it is relative, is made to seem essential when it is superficial, is made to seem threatening when it is merely unfamiliar. And the unfamiliar is what the culture cannot tolerate, cannot integrate, cannot acknowledge without threatening the narrative, without disturbing the reflection, without revealing that the mirror is distorting, is lying, is showing not reality but fantasy. And the fantasy is collective, is shared, is believed, not because evidence supports it, but because the culture requires it, requires the belief that we are good, are just, are noble, are superior, and the superior is the story that every empire tells, is the myth that every dominant culture maintains, is the narrative that justifies conquest, exploitation, domination. Because if we are superior, then we have the right to rule, have the obligation to civilize, have the duty to spread our ways to those who are inferior, who are backward, who are lacking what we have. And what we have is not just wealth or technology or power, but is virtue, is morality, is the right way of being human. And the right way is our way, is the only way, is the way that must be imposed on others for their own good. And the good is what we define, is what our mirror shows, is what our mythology proclaims. And the proclaiming is not questioned internally, is not doubted by members, is accepted as truth, as obvious as the way things are. Because the culture has been internalized, has been absorbed, has become the framework through which reality is perceived, and perception is always filtered, is always shaped by the categories that culture provides, by the concepts that language offers, by the narratives that mythology supplies, and the supply is constant, is reinforced through education, through media, through the rituals that celebrate the culture, through the symbols that represent it, through the history that is taught, and the teaching is selective, is presenting only the parts that confirm the narrative, that support the myth, that maintain the reflection, and the reflection shows heroes, shows triumphs, shows progress, shows the culture moving toward perfection, toward the realization of its values, toward the fulfillment of its destiny. And the destiny is what the myth claims, is the belief that the culture is not just existing, but is going somewhere, is fulfilling a purpose, is playing a role in a larger story. And the story is always about us, is always centered on our experience, is always presenting our perspective as the perspective, our values as the values, our way as the way. And the way is not recognized as particular, but is experienced as universal, is not seen as one option among many, but is felt as the natural, the normal, the correct. And the correct is what blindness produces, is what the mirror creates, is the inability to see that the reflection is distorted, that the image is idealized, that the narrative is selective, and the selective is what creates the blind spots, is what prevents the culture from seeing its own violence, its own exploitation, its own contradictions, because these do not fit the narrative, do not confirm the myth, do not appear in the mirror, and so they are not seen, are not acknowledged, are not integrated into the culture's self-understanding, and the understanding remains partial, remains distorted, remains narcissistic, and the narcissism is not pathological in the individual sense, but is structural, is built into the way that cultures function, is necessary for cohesion, for identity, for the maintenance of boundaries. Because without the belief that we are special, the culture would dissolve, would fragment, would lose the binding force that makes a collection of individuals into a collective. And the collective requires mythology, requires shared stories, requires the mirror that reflects not individuals, but the group, not reality, but the ideal, not what is, but what is imagined. And the imagined is powerful, is shaping behavior, is creating expectations, is defining roles, is organizing life. And the organization is not neutral, is not innocent, is serving interests, is maintaining hierarchies, is justifying inequalities. Because the mythology always benefits some more than others, always privileges certain positions, always legitimates certain arrangements. And the legitimation is what the mirror provides, is what the myth accomplishes, is the conversion of contingent social arrangements into natural necessities of historical accidents, into inevitable developments of particular values, into universal truths. And the truths are not true, but are believed, are accepted, are acted upon. And the acting upon is what makes them real, in a sense, is what gives them power, is what makes them consequential. Because collective beliefs shape collective action, shape policy, shape war, shape empire. An empire is always justified through mythology, is always presenting itself as bringing civilization, bringing progress, bringing enlightenment to those who lack it. And the lack is projected, is assumed, is what the mirror does not show about the empire itself, which is that what it brings is often destruction, is exploitation, is the imposition of its ways onto others who did not ask for them, do not want them, are harmed by them, but the harm is not seen, is not reflected in the mirror, is not part of the narrative, because the narrative is about benevolence, about mission, about the burden that the superior must bear, and the burden is the story that Kipling told, is the myth that empires use, is the claim that domination is duty, that conquest is care. That exploitation is education, and the education is the transfer of culture, is the spreading of the superior ways, is the civilizing mission that justifies everything, that makes violence noble, that makes theft righteous, that makes subjugation liberation. And the liberation is what the empire claims to bring, is what its mythology proclaims, is what its mirror reflects. And the reflection is believed not just by rulers, but by the ruled, not just by exploiters, but by the exploited, because the mythology is totalizing, is pervasive, is shaping consciousness, is providing the categories through which experience is understood. An understanding within the mythology confirms the mythology, is circular, is self-reinforcing, is making it difficult to see outside, to recognize the distortion, to notice that the mirror is lying, and the lying is not intentional, is not conspiracy, is structural, is the way that collective narcissism operates, is the inevitable result of cultures needing to see themselves as good, as just, as right. And the right is always defined by the culture itself, is always reflecting back what the culture wants to see, is never showing what the culture is afraid to see, which is its own violence, its own hypocrisy, its own contingency. And the contingency is what every national myth denies, is what every claim to exceptionalism rejects, is the recognition that this culture could have been otherwise, that its values are not universal, but are particular, that its supremacy is not deserved, but is the result of power, of conquest, of accident. And the accident is what cannot be admitted, is what the mythology covers, is what the mirror hides, because admitting accident is admitting that the culture is not special, is not chosen, is not fulfilling destiny, but is just existing, just happening, just being one arrangement among many possible arrangements. And the many is what threatens, is what the other represents, is what must be denied in order to maintain the belief that we are the centre, are the standard, are the measure. And the measure is how cultures see others, is how they project onto difference. Everything they reject in themselves is how they create the barbarian, the savage, the backward, the enemy. And the enemy is necessary, is required by the mythology, is what defines the culture by contrast, is what makes us good by being bad, is what makes us civilized by being savage, is what makes us superior by being inferior. And the inferior is not discovered but is created, is constructed through the selection of differences, through the exaggeration of contrasts, through the interpretation of practices as evidence of backwardness. And the backwardness is what justifies intervention, justifies domination, justifies the spreading of our ways, because if they are backward, then they need us, need our help, need our civilization. And the civilization is what we bring, what we impose, what we force upon them for their own good. And the good is what we define, is what our values dictate, is what our mythology proclaims. And the proclaiming is not listening, is not dialogue, is not exchange, is imposition, is violence, is the erasure of their culture in the name of bringing them ours. And the erasure is not seen as violence, but is seen as progress, is seen as liberation, is seen as the inevitable movement toward the universal, which is really the particular disguised as universal, is our particular values presented as the values, our particular ways presented as the way, our particular culture presented as culture itself. And culture itself is what we believe we are, is what the mirror shows, is what the mythology claims, that we are not just a culture, but our culture, are not just civilized, but our civilization, are not just one way of being human, but are the way, the correct way, the superior way, and the superiority is what cannot be questioned internally, is what is taboo to doubt, is what is defended violently when challenged. Because challenging the myth is challenging the culture's identity, is threatening the collective narcissism, is disturbing the mirror, and the mirror must be maintained, must be protected, must be polished, because without it the culture would have to see itself as it is, would have to confront its ordinariness, its violence, its contradictions. And the contradictions are everywhere, are visible to outsiders, are obvious to those who are not invested in the mythology, but are invisible to insiders, are not reflected in the mirror, are edited out of the narrative, are the blind spots that every culture has, that every mythology creates, that every collective narcissism requires, because seeing the contradictions would require changing, would require admitting error, would require acknowledging that the culture is not what it claims to be, is not as good as it believes, is not as just as it proclaims, and the proclaiming is constant, is part of the mythology, is the endless assertion that we are different, are better, are special, are the exception to the patterns that govern other cultures. And the exception is what every empire believes, is the myth of American exceptionalism, of British civilizing mission, of French universal values, of every dominant culture that has ever existed, each believing that it is different, that it is not like the empires that came before, that its domination is justified where others were not, that its violence is necessary where others was cruel, that its expansion is liberation where others was conquest. And the difference is illusion, is projection, is the mirror showing what the culture needs to see, which is that we are good, are noble, are doing what is right, and the right is whatever we are doing, is whatever serves our interests, is whatever maintains our power, and the power is presented as service, as burden, as duty, and the duty is what the mythology creates, is the belief that we must spread our ways, must bring our civilization, must impose our order, because without us the world would be chaos, would be darkness, would be backward, and the backward is where others are, is what defines them, is what justifies our dominance, and the dominance is not called dominance, but is called leadership, is called guidance, is called help. And the help is not asked for, is not wanted, is imposed, is forced, is the violence that the mirror does not show, that the mythology does not name, that the culture does not see, because seeing it would require shattering the mirror, would require abandoning the myth, would require confronting the collective narcissism. And the confronting is what cannot happen, is what is too threatening, is what would destroy the culture's sense of itself. And the sense of itself is what the culture is the only coherence it has, is the mythology that makes it a culture rather than just a collection of people. And so the mirror is maintained, the myth is preserved, the narcissism continues, and the culture sees itself as it needs to see itself, as special, as superior, as exceptional. And the exceptional is what every culture believes, is the universal delusion, is the distorted reflection that is mistaken for reality, is the mirror stage of culture where the culture is forever trapped, forever seeing the idealized image, forever believing the mythology, forever blind to the contradictions, forever projecting onto others what it cannot acknowledge in itself, forever creating the other who absorbs the negativity, who represents the threat, who justifies the violence, and the violence continues, the mythology persists, the mirror remains, and cultures continue to see themselves as the center, as the standard, as the exception, and the exception is the lie, is the delusion, is the collective narcissism that every culture exhibits, that every mythology maintains, that every mirror reflects, and the reflecting is distorting, is hiding, is preventing the culture from seeing what it is, from acknowledging its contingency, from recognizing its violence, from confronting its contradictions, from shattering the mirror, from abandoning the myth, from giving up the narcissism. And the giving up is impossible, is what cultures cannot do, is what would mean their dissolution, their end, their transformation into something else. And the something else is what is feared, is what the mythology prevents, is what the mirror hides, is what the collective narcissism protects against. And the protection is the function, is what the distorted reflection accomplishes, is what makes cultures culture, is what allows collective identity, is what creates the binding force, and the force is mythology, is narrative, is the mirror that shows not truth, but need, not reality, but fantasy, not what is, but what must be believed. And the belief is collective, is shared, is the myth that we are special, are chosen, are exceptional, and the exceptional is the delusion, is the mirror stage of culture, is the permanent condition of collective consciousness, is the way that societies see themselves as distorted reflections, as idealized images, as mythological narratives, and the narratives are false, are projections, are narcissistic, and the narcissism is structural, is necessary, is what makes culture possible, is what creates cohesion, is what maintains the illusion that we are the center, are the standard, are the measure, and the measure is the mirror, is the myth, is the collective narcissism that every culture exhibits, that every society maintains, that every empire believes, that every nation proclaims. And the proclaiming is the distortion, is the reflection, is the mirror stage where culture is trapped, where it sees itself not as it is, but as it needs to be, not as truth, but as mythology, not as one among many, but as the one, the exceptional, the special, the superior. And the superior is the lie, is the mirror, is the stage where culture performs for itself, where it reflects its own image, where it sees only what it wants to see. And what it wants to see is that it matters, that it is right, that it is good. And the good is the reflection, is the myth, is the collective narcissism, is the mirror stage of culture where every culture is trapped, where every society remains, where every empire believes its own mythology, and the mythology is the mirror, is the distortion, is the way that cultures see themselves, as exceptional, as special, as superior. And the superior is the delusion, is the projection, is the narcissism, is the mirror stage that never ends, that continues forever, that defines culture, that creates the blind spots, that maintains the myth, that polishes the mirror, that reflects the lie. And the lie is believed, is shared, is what makes culture culture. And culture is the mirror, is the stage, is the collective narcissism, is the distorted reflection, is the mythology, is the illusion that we are exceptional, and the exceptional is what every culture believes, is the universal delusion, is the mirror stage of culture that shows not truth but need, not reality but fantasy, not what is but what must be seen. And the seeing is distorted, is narcissistic, is collective, is the way that cultures see themselves, forever, inevitably, necessarily, as the center, as the standard, as the exception. And the exception is the myth, is the mirror, is the stage where culture performs, where it reflects, where it believes its own lies, and the lies are the culture, are the mythology, are the collective narcissism, are the mirror stage that every society inhabits, that every culture maintains, that every empire believes. And the believing is the distortion, is the reflection, is the way that cultures see themselves as exceptional when they are ordinary, as superior when they are equal, as chosen when they are contingent. And the contingent is what the mirror hides, is what the myth denies, is what the collective narcissism protects against. And the protection is permanent, is structural, is what makes the mirror stage of culture eternal, inevitable, universal. The way that all societies see themselves as distorted reflections, as idealized images, as mythological narratives that are believed, that are shared, that are maintained, that are the culture, that are the mirror, that are the stage, that are the collective narcissism that defines human social existence, that creates the blind spots, that justifies the violence, that maintains the myth, that every culture exhibits, that every society believes, that every empire proclaims. And the proclaiming is the mirror, is the stage, is the distorted reflection that is culture seeing itself. When probability contradicts intuition, there is a game show, a host, 3 doors, behind one door a car, behind the other 2 goats. The contestant picks a door. The host, who knows what is behind each door, opens a different door, revealing a goat. Then offers the contestant a choice: stay with the original door or switch to the remaining unopened door. And almost everyone's intuition says, it does not matter, says the probability is now 50-50, says switching and staying are equivalent because there are 2 doors left and one has the car. But this intuition is completely wrong. Switching doubles the chance of winning, gives a 2/3 probability instead of 1/3. And this is the Monty Hall problem, named after the host of Let's Make a Deal. And it has become famous not just as a probability puzzle, but as a demonstration of how badly human intuition performs with probability, how confidently people cling to wrong answers, how even mathematicians and statisticians initially rejected the correct solution. And this raises deep questions about rationality, about whether humans are capable of probabilistic reasoning, about whether intuition can be trusted in any domain, about what it means to be rational if rationality requires calculations that almost no one can perform. The solution requires seeing that the initial choice had a 1/3 chance of being correct, which means there was a 2/3 chance the car was behind one of the other 2 doors. And when the host opens one of those doors revealing a goat, that 2/3 probability does not disappear, it transfers entirely to the remaining unopened door. So switching gives a 2/3 chance while staying gives only the original 1/3 chance. And this can be proven mathematically, can be demonstrated through computer simulation, can be explained through careful reasoning about conditional probability, but none of this stops people from insisting the answer must be 50-50, from rejecting the correct solution as absurd, from trusting their intuition over the mathematics. And this is not stupidity, not ignorance, not carelessness. This is the way human minds naturally process probability, the way intuition works when confronted with conditional probabilities and updating in light of new evidence. And the fact that intuition gets it wrong reveals something troubling about human rationality, about the gap between how we think we reason and how we actually reason, about the possibility that many of our confident judgments about probability are as wrong as the intuition that switching does not matter. Bayesian epistemology takes probability as fundamental to rational belief, says that beliefs should be assigned degrees of confidence, that these degrees should obey the probability calculus, that they should update through Bayes' theorem when new evidence arrives. And this seems like the right way to think about belief, seems to capture how science works, how learning happens, how rational agents should respond to evidence. But the Monty Hall problem shows that humans are not natural Bayesians, do not intuitively update probabilities correctly, do not automatically apply Bayes' theorem, do not even recognize when a situation calls for probabilistic reasoning rather than simple counting. And if this is true, then Bayesian epistemology is not a description of how humans actually reason, but a normative standard that almost no one meets, an ideal that is psychologically unrealistic, a requirement for rationality that makes rationality impossible for creatures like us. Kahneman and Tversky spent decades documenting the ways human probability judgments deviate from normative standards. The base rate neglect, where people ignore prior probabilities. The conjunction fallacy, where people judge conjunctions more probable than their components. The availability heuristic, where people estimate probability based on how easily examples come to mind. And these are not occasional errors, but systematic biases. Not mistakes that education eliminates, but deep features of human cognition that persist, even in experts, even in people who understand probability theory, even in situations where people are explicitly trying to reason correctly. And this research suggests that human minds are not built for probability, that our intuitions evolved for different problems, for quick judgments in environments where exact probabilities were unknown and unknowable, where rough heuristics that usually worked were better than precise calculations that took too long. And these heuristics still dominate our thinking, still produce judgments that feel right even when they are mathematically wrong. And the question is whether we should try to override these intuitions, should try to become more Bayesian, should train ourselves to calculate rather than intuit, or whether we should accept that humans are not and cannot be perfectly rational in the Bayesian sense, should build theories of rationality that fit how we actually think, rather than demanding we think in ways that are psychologically impossible. The reference class problem makes this even more difficult, because applying probability requires knowing what reference class to use, what group of similar cases to draw on when estimating probability, and there is often no unique right answer. Many reference classes are possible. They give different probabilities, and there is no mechanical rule for choosing among them. Only judgment, only intuition, only the same kind of thinking that gets Monty Hall wrong. And this means that even if humans could perfectly apply Bayes' theorem, even if we could update probabilities flawlessly, we would still face the problem of choosing which probabilities to start with, which reference class to use, which background assumptions to make. And these choices are not themselves governed by probability theory, are not mechanical, are not subject to the kind of rational constraint that Bayesianism promises. And this suggests that probabilistic rationality cannot be purely computational, cannot be reduced to algorithms, cannot eliminate the need for judgment that might be right or wrong in ways that transcend calculation. Subjective Bayesianism tries to handle this by saying that prior probabilities are subjective, are personal degrees of confidence that can differ between rational agents. And as long as priors satisfy the probability axioms and updating follows Bayes' theorem, any priors are rationally permissible, and agents with different priors will converge on the same posteriors given enough shared evidence, or so the theorem says. But this convergence can take a very long time, can require more evidence than is ever available. And in the meantime, agents with different priors will reach different conclusions, will make different predictions, will act differently, and there is no rational way to adjudicate between them. No standard that says one set of priors is better than another. No requirement beyond internal consistency. And this seems too permissive, seems to make rationality trivial, seems to allow anything as rational as long as it obeys the probability calculus. and conspiracy theorists obey the probability calculus. They just have different priors. They assign high probability to things most people assign low probability to, and they update on evidence in their own way, and by subjective Bayesian standards, they might be perfectly rational. Just starting from different priors. And this cannot be right. This is not what rationality means. There must be some constraint on priors, some requirement beyond consistency, some standard that distinguishes reasonable from unreasonable starting points. But what that standard is, how to specify it, how to justify it without circularity, these questions have no clear answer. Objective Bayesianism tries to solve this by saying there are objective priors, that some probability assignments are privileged by logic or symmetry or information theory, that the principle of indifference or maximum entropy or some other principle determines what priors rationality requires. But each of these principles faces problems. The principle of indifference leads to paradoxes when applied to continuous quantities or overlapping partitions. Maximum entropy requires choosing a measure, and different measures give different entropies, and none of these principles seems to capture what we pre-theoretically think rationality requires. None of them vindicates our intuitive judgments about which beliefs are reasonable. And this suggests that the project of grounding probability in pure logic or symmetry has failed, that probability is not a priori but depends on empirical facts, on the actual frequencies in the world, on the causal structure of reality. And this leads back to frequentism, to the view that probabilities are objective features of the world, are long-run frequencies or propensities or chances built into the physical processes. But frequentism faces its own problems. The reference class problem returns, the problem of single cases where frequency makes no sense, the problem that different sequences can have the same frequency but seem to have different probabilities, and the debate between subjective and objective interpretations of probability remains unresolved. Remains one of the deepest puzzles in philosophy of science and epistemology, remains a place where intuition gives conflicting verdicts, and mathematics does not uniquely determine the right answer. The Monty Hall problem can be generalized, can be seen as an instance of a broader phenomenon where updating on evidence is counterintuitive, where the correct probability depends on assumptions about the process that generated the evidence, about whether the host had to open a door with a goat or could have opened any door, about whether the host knows where the car is or is opening doors randomly, and changing these assumptions changes the correct answer, changes whether switching is advantageous, and this shows that probability is not just about counting possibilities, but about modelling processes, about understanding the causal structure that generates observations, about getting the model right before applying the mathematics. And humans are bad at this, bad at seeing which model applies, bad at noticing when assumptions have changed, bad at tracking the difference between probability given this model and probability given that model. And this is another way intuition fails, another place where what seems obvious is wrong, another demonstration that probabilistic reasoning is hard, harder than it seems, harder than most people realize. The three prisoners problem is similar. Three prisoners, one will be pardoned, a guard knows who but will not tell. One prisoner asks the guard to name one of the other prisoners who will not be pardoned. The guard names one, and the prisoner reasons that his probability of pardon has increased from 1/3 to 1/2 because now there are only two prisoners in the running. But this reasoning is wrong. His probability is still 1/3. The other prisoner's probability is now 2/3. And this is the same structure as Monty Hall, the same failure of intuition, the same mistake of thinking that eliminating one possibility distributes its probability equally among the remainder, when really the distribution depends on how the elimination happened, on whether it was random or constrained by knowledge. And the fact that the same mistake appears in different guises, that people make the same error repeatedly, even after being corrected, suggests this is not a mistake about particular problems, but a mistake about how probability works. A fundamental misunderstanding of conditional probability, of updating, of what it means for probabilities to change in light of evidence. Simpson's paradox is another case where intuition fails, where a trend appears in several groups, but reverses when the groups are combined, where a treatment seems effective in every subgroup but harmful overall, where the correct probability judgment depends on which level of description you adopt, which grouping you consider relevant, and there is often no mathematical fact about which grouping is right, only substantive judgment about causal structure, about which variables are relevant, about what the right reference class is, and this is the reference class problem again. The problem that probability requires not just mathematics but modelling, not just calculation, but judgment, and judgment can be wrong in ways that calculation cannot, can depend on intuitions that mislead, can vary between people who have access to the same mathematical facts, and this means that probabilistic rationality is not purely formal, not reducible to following rules, not something that could be programmed into a computer without also giving the computer the ability to model the world, to understand causal structure, to make substantive judgments about relevance and independence, and which factors matter. And these abilities seem to require something like understanding, something like intelligence, something that goes beyond computation in any narrow sense. The Sleeping Beauty problem pushes this even further. Sleeping Beauty is put to sleep on Sunday. A fair coin is flipped. If heads, she is woken on Monday, and the experiment ends. If tails, she is woken on Monday, put back to sleep with memory erasure, and woken again on Tuesday. And when she wakes, she knows all this, but not what day it is or how the coin landed. And she's asked what probability she should assign to heads. And one argument says 1/2 because it is a fair coin, and her evidence does not distinguish heads from tails. And another argument says 1/3 because there are 3 possible wakings: Monday heads, Monday tails, Tuesday tails, and she should be equally uncertain about which one she is experiencing. And both arguments seem compelling. Both seem to capture something right about probability, but they give different answers, and philosophers have divided into halfers and thirders, have written papers and books arguing for their position, and no consensus has emerged, no decisive argument has appeared. And this suggests that probability itself is ambiguous, that there is no fact of the matter about. What probability means in cases like this, that different probability concepts give different answers, and there is no neutral standpoint from which to say which concept is correct. And if this is true, then rationality does not uniquely determine belief, does not provide the kind of objective standard that Bayesianism promised, allows for rational disagreement, even given identical evidence and identical priors in some sense. And this is disturbing, suggests that rationality is weaker than we thought, less constraining, less objective, more dependent on choices about how to frame problems and which probability concept to apply. The fine-tuning argument in philosophy of religion uses probability reasoning that many find suspicious, claims that the probability of a life-permitting universe is extremely low on naturalism, but not as low on theism, and therefore the existence of a life-permitting universe is evidence for theism. And this argument has the structure of Bayesian inference, has priors and likelihoods, and posteriors, but the probabilities involved seem impossible to specify, seem to require knowing about the space of possible universes and the probability distribution over them, and whether such probabilities even make sense. And skeptics argue that the argument trades on intuitions about probability that are as unreliable as the intuition that switching does not matter in Monty Hall, that it smuggles in assumptions through choices about reference classes, that it treats unknown probabilities as if they were 50-50 when there is no justification for this, and defenders argue that this is the only way to reason about such questions. That probability is the language of uncertainty, and if we cannot use probability, we cannot reason about unlikely events at all. And both sides seem right in some sense. Both seem to be pointing to real problems, and the debate remains unresolved because there is no agreed standard for when probability reasoning applies, for what makes a probability assignment reasonable, for how to choose reference classes in novel situations. The anthropic principle raises similar issues. The observation that we exist as observers places constraints on what we can observe. We cannot observe universes that do not permit observers, and this truism has been turned into arguments about probability, about whether observer selection effects should change our credences, about whether the fact that we are here is evidence for multiverse theories or fine-tuning or something else, and different formulations of the anthropic principle give different answers. The self-sampling assumption says you should reason as if you are a random sample from all observers. The self-indication assumption says you should favour theories that predict more observers, and these give conflicting recommendations, give different probabilities for the same observations, and there is no consensus about which is correct, no compelling argument that one captures rationality and the other does not. And this is another instance of the general problem, that probability reasoning requires background assumptions, requires choices about how to set up the problem, and these choices are not dictated by probability theory itself, are not mechanical, are not subject to the kind of objective, rational constraint that would make probabilistic epistemology a complete theory of rational belief. The possibility remains that human intuition about probability, despite being systematically wrong in many cases, is right in some deeper sense, is adapted to a different kind of rationality than mathematical probability captures, is tuned to ecological rather than abstract problems, to frequencies encountered in real environments rather than to single-case probabilities in artificial puzzles. And Gigerenzer has argued exactly this, has argued that humans are better at frequency reasoning than probability reasoning, that framing Monty Hall in terms of frequencies rather than probabilities makes the right answer intuitive, that many of the biases Kahneman and Tversky documented disappear when problems are presented in ways that match our evolutionary history. And this suggests that the problem is not with human rationality, but with the mismatch between how probability theory frames problems and how human minds naturally frame them. And if this is right, then the solution is not to train people to be more Bayesian, but to recognize that formal probability is one tool among many, appropriate for some contexts but not others, and that intuitive reasoning has its own logic, its own standards, its own domain of applicability, and trying to replace it entirely with formal calculation would be a mistake, would lose something valuable, would sacrifice the kind of quick approximate reasoning that actually works in most real-world situations for the sake of precision that is rarely achievable and often not worth the computational cost. The eye cannot see itself without a mirror, and even then what appears in the reflection is reversed, backward, fundamentally altered by the act of observation, and this simple fact about vision contains within it a deeper truth about consciousness, about the strange recursive loop that happens when awareness tries to become aware of itself, when the mind attempts to know the mind, when the self turns inward to discover what the self actually is, and what it finds, or thinks it finds, is never quite the thing doing the finding, never quite the observer, but always the observed, always one step removed, always a representation rather than the thing itself. And this gap, this irreducible distance between the knower and the known, when both are supposedly the same entity, creates a problem that has troubled philosophers since humans first developed the capacity to ask who they are, a problem that might not have a solution because the very structure of self-knowledge contains a contradiction, a paradox built into the architecture of introspection that makes genuine self-understanding not just difficult, but perhaps logically impossible. The ancient Greeks carved into the temple at Delphi the command to know thyself, and Socrates spent his life insisting that the unexamined life is not worth living, that self-knowledge is the foundation of wisdom, the beginning of philosophy, the path to virtue. But Socrates also claimed to know nothing, claimed that his only wisdom was recognizing his ignorance, and perhaps these two positions are connected. Perhaps the examination of the self leads inevitably to the discovery that the self cannot be known, that the more carefully one looks inward, the more elusive the thing being sought becomes, like trying to grasp water or catch one's own shadow. And this elusiveness is not an accident, not a failure of attention or effort, but something essential to what consciousness is, something about how the mind works that makes it constitutively opaque to itself, forever mysterious, forever strange. When someone sits quietly and tries to observe their own thoughts, tries to watch the mind in action, something peculiar happens. The thoughts change. They become different thoughts, self-conscious thoughts, thoughts about thinking, and the original spontaneous flow of mental activity that was supposed to be observed has already been altered by the act of observation, has been replaced by a different kind of mental activity, the activity of observing. And this is the observer effect in consciousness, borrowed from quantum physics, where the act of measurement changes what is being measured, where particles behave differently when watched. And though the analogy is imperfect, though consciousness is not exactly like quantum systems, there is something similar happening, something about awareness that transforms its object, that cannot leave things as they are. And this means that introspection is never neutral, never a clear window onto the mind, but always an intervention, always a distortion. And what is seen in introspection is not the mind as it normally operates, but the mind as it operates when being observed, which is a different mind, a mind in a different state, performing a different function. The psychologist Timothy Wilson calls this the introspection illusion, the false belief that people have direct access to their mental processes, that they can simply look inward and discover why they feel what they feel, why they believe what they believe, why they did what they did. But decades of research in cognitive psychology show that introspection is unreliable, that people confidently report reasons for their behavior that are simply wrong, that they confabulate explanations without realizing they are confabulating, that the mind generates plausible sounding stories about itself, but these stories are not reports from the inside, are not transcripts of actual mental processes, but rather are post hoc rationalizations, narratives constructed after the fact to make sense of actions that were caused by processes the conscious mind never had access to in the first place. In one famous experiment, researchers showed people photographs and asked them to choose which face they found more attractive. And after the choice was made, the researchers used sleight of hand to swap the photographs, showing people the face they did not choose and asking them to explain why they chose it. And the majority of people did not notice the switch, did not realize they were explaining a choice they never made, and they generated detailed explanations, talked about the eyes, the smile, the overall impression, completely convinced they were reporting genuine introspective insights, when in fact they were making up reasons, on the spot, confabulating freely. And this was not lying, was not intentional deception, because the people genuinely believed their own explanations, genuinely felt they were accurately describing their mental processes. But they were not, they were creating a story. And this is what introspection often is, not discovery, but creation, not observation, but fabrication. And the frightening part is that it feels identical from the inside. There is no phenomenological difference between genuine self-knowledge and convincing self-deception. No way to tell, just by introspecting, whether the reasons being accessed are real or invented, whether the self-understanding being achieved is accurate or illusory. The philosopher Gilbert Ryle argued against what he called the ghost in the machine, against the Cartesian idea that there is an inner mental theatre where a homunculus, a little person inside the head, watches experiences unfold on a screen, And Ryle pointed out that this model leads to infinite regress. Because if there is a homunculus watching the screen, then what is watching the homunculus? What is aware of the awareness? And this question repeats indefinitely, creating an infinite stack of observers, which is absurd, which suggests the model is wrong, that consciousness is not structured like a theatre with an audience, that there is no central viewing point, no little self inside observing the big self. But if this is true, if there is no homunculus, then what is introspection? What is happening when it feels like the self is observing itself? And the answer might be that nothing is being observed, that introspection is a kind of cognitive illusion, a trick the brain plays, a way of accessing some information about its own state, but mistaking this limited, partial access for complete transparency, for total self-knowledge, when really most of what the brain does is hidden, is unconscious, is inaccessible to the part that thinks it is doing the knowing. Freud built an entire therapeutic method on the premise that the self is largely unknown to itself, that beneath the conscious mind lies the unconscious, vast and dark and full of repressed desires, traumatic memories, primitive drives, and that the work of psychoanalysis is to make the unconscious conscious, to bring into awareness what has been hidden, to achieve insight. And for Freud, insight was curative. Knowing why you're anxious or depressed or behaving strangely would dissolve the symptom, would free you from the tyranny of forces you did not understand. But the history of psychoanalysis is also a history of people discovering things about themselves that they do not recognize, that feel foreign, that seem like they must belong to someone else. And the analyst says, "This is you. This desire, this rage, this fear." And the patient says, "No, that is not me. I do not feel that way." And the analyst says, "You are resisting. You are defending against the truth." And maybe the analyst is right. Maybe resistance is real. But maybe also the patient is right. Maybe what the analyst is finding through interpretation is not the hidden self, but another construct, another story, not more true than the patient's own story, just differently structured. And the question becomes, whose interpretation counts as knowledge? Who gets to say what the self really is when the self being analysed does not recognise itself in the analysis? Carl Rogers, the humanistic psychologist, took a different approach, argued that the therapist should not interpret, should not claim to know the client better than the client knows themselves, but should rather create conditions where the client can explore their own experience, can come to their own understanding. And Rogers believed that people have an innate capacity for self-awareness, that given the right environment of empathy and unconditional, positive regard, the true self would emerge. But even Rogers noticed something strange, noticed that people in therapy often encountered aspects of themselves that surprised them, that contradicted their self-concept, that felt like meeting a stranger. And sometimes this stranger was more real than the familiar self. Sometimes the person they thought they were turned out to be a performance, a mask, a role they had been playing for so long they forgot it was a role. And the therapeutic process was not discovering the self, but discovering that the self they thought they knew was a fiction. And underneath that fiction was not another, more authentic self, but just more layers, more complexity, more contradictions that resist integration into a single, coherent narrative. The philosopher Paul Ricoeur wrote about the hermeneutics of suspicion, about thinkers like Marx and Nietzsche and Freud, who taught that consciousness is false consciousness, that what people believe about themselves is ideology or rationalization or symptom, that the surface meaning is never the real meaning, that everything must be interpreted, decoded, suspected. And Ricoeur saw this as both necessary and dangerous. Necessary because people do deceive themselves, do operate under illusions, but dangerous because it leads to a paranoid style of thinking where nothing is taken at face value, where every claim to self-knowledge is dismissed as naive, where the expert, the analyst, The critical theorist always knows better than the person living the life. And this dynamic is a power dynamic, is a way of invalidating someone's experience, of saying, you do not know yourself, but I know you. And Ricoeur tried to balance the hermeneutics of suspicion with a hermeneutics of trust. Try to preserve the possibility that people sometimes do know themselves, that introspection sometimes does reveal genuine truths. But even he could not escape the problem that the self who is trusting their own introspection might be the one most deceived, might be the one who needs suspicion the most. And so the circle closes. The paradox remains: how to know whether you know yourself when the instrument of knowing is the same instrument being examined, when the eye trying to see itself has no independent vantage point, no place to stand outside the system. Neuroscience has added new dimensions to this problem, has shown that the brain is not a unified system, but a collection of subsystems, modules, networks that often operate independently, sometimes in conflict, and that what is experienced as the self, as the unified conscious agent, is really a construct, an emergent property, a story the brain tells about the activity of its parts. And this story is useful, helps coordinate behavior, helps navigate social environments, but it is not an accurate map of the underlying territory, not a faithful representation of how the brain actually works. And the neuroscientist Michael Gazzaniga studied split-brain patients, people whose corpus callosum, the bundle of nerves connecting the two hemispheres, had been severed to treat epilepsy. And in these patients, the two hemispheres can be shown different information, can be asked to perform different tasks. And what Gazzaniga found is that the left hemisphere, the one responsible for language, will confabulate explanations for actions initiated by the right hemisphere, will create stories to explain behavior it did not cause and does not understand. And the patient is not aware of confabulating, genuinely believes the explanations, and Gazzaniga calls the left hemisphere the interpreter, argues that one of its primary functions is to generate a coherent narrative of the self, to make sense of the chaos of neural activity, to create the illusion of unity and purpose and understanding. And if the left hemisphere does this in split-brain patients, it is likely doing it in everyone, all the time, constantly interpreting, constantly explaining, constantly constructing a self that feels real but might be mostly fiction. The Buddhist tradition has long taught that the self is an illusion, that what is called the self is really just a collection of aggregates, body and sensations, and perceptions, and mental formations, and consciousness. And these aggregates are constantly changing, never stable, never autonomous, always conditioned by causes beyond their control. And the belief in a permanent, independent self is the root of suffering, is what causes attachment and aversion. And the path to liberation is to see through this illusion, to experience directly the absence of self, the emptiness. And this teaching is not theoretical, but experiential, is something that advanced meditators report encountering: the dissolution of the sense of self, the realization that there is no one home, no center, no observer, just experience arising and passing. And Western scientists studying meditation have found that certain practices do alter brain activity in regions associated with self-reference, do reduce the default mode network that activates when people are thinking about themselves. And some meditators describe this as liberating, as a relief, as finally seeing clearly, but others find it terrifying, find that the loss of self feels like annihilation, like death. And the question is whether what the meditators are discovering is the truth about the self, or just another state of consciousness, just a different way of experiencing, and whether there is any way to know which interpretation is correct, whether the self that feels so solid in ordinary consciousness is the illusion, or whether the no self experienced in deep meditation is the illusion, or whether both are valid descriptions of different aspects of the same underlying reality that cannot be captured completely by either framework. David Hume in the 18th century tried to find the self through introspection, tried to locate the I that supposedly unifies experience, and he reported that he could never find it, that when he looked inward, all he found were particular perceptions, particular thoughts and feelings and sensations, but never the self that was supposedly having these perceptions, never the subject separate from the objects of consciousness. And Hume concluded that the self is a fiction, a bundle of perceptions held together by memory and causation, but not by any underlying substance. And this conclusion disturbed him. He admitted that his skepticism about the self led to a kind of philosophical melancholy, a sense of being lost in a labyrinth with no exit. But even as he doubted the existence of the self, he continued to use the first person, continued to say, I think, I feel, I conclude. And this tension, this inability to live, according to the implications of the philosophy, shows how deeply the sense of self is embedded, how resistant it is to intellectual dissolution. And perhaps this is because the self is not a thing to be found through introspection, but a process, a doing rather than a being, the activity of organizing experience rather than an entity that exists independently of that activity. And if this is true, then looking for the self is like trying to find the dance apart from the dancing, trying to locate the song separate from the singing, and the failure to find it does not prove. It does not exist, but rather proves that the question is malformed, that existence is the wrong category, that the self is not the kind of thing that can be observed because it is the observing, not the object, but the act. And this shift in framing does not solve the problem, but relocates it, makes the question not whether the self exists, but what kind of thing it is, what kind of existence it has, and whether this kind of existence is compatible with self-knowledge, or whether self-knowledge in the traditional sense, knowledge of an object by a subject, is structurally impossible when subject and object are the same. Philosophers sometimes distinguish between phenomenal consciousness, the what-it-is likeness of experience, and access consciousness, the information available for use in reasoning and report, and they note that these can come apart, that there might be experiences that feel like something but cannot be accessed, cannot be reported, cannot be known by the person having them. And this suggests that consciousness is not transparent to itself, that there are aspects of subjective experience that are hidden even from the subject. And if this is true, then the project of self-knowledge faces an even deeper obstacle. Not just the problem of the observer effect or confabulation, but the problem that some of what the self is, some of what makes experience what it is in principle inaccessible, is locked away in a part of consciousness that has no connection to the part that can reflect and report. And this inaccessible region might be small, or it might be vast, might be a minor footnote to consciousness, or might be the bulk of it. And there is no way to know, because by definition, it cannot be known, cannot be brought into awareness. And so, self-knowledge, even in the best case, is always partial, always incomplete, always missing something essential that remains forever in darkness. The question then becomes not whether complete self-knowledge is possible, because it is not, but whether partial self-knowledge is worth pursuing, whether the fragments of understanding that can be achieved through introspection and therapy and meditation and neuroscience are valuable, even if they are fragments, even if they do not add up to a complete picture. And the answer might be yes, might be that partial knowledge is better than none, that understanding some of the forces shaping thought and behaviour is better than understanding nothing, that the attempt to know the self, even if it cannot fully succeed, makes life more deliberate, more examined, more awake. And this is what Socrates might have meant. Not that self-knowledge is achievable, but that the examination is valuable, that the questioning itself, the refusal to accept the surface, the insistence on looking deeper, even when the depths remain murky, is what distinguishes a life worth living from a life lived in automaticity, in habit, in the sleep of unexamined assumption, and perhaps the paradox of self-knowledge is not a problem to be solved, but a tension to be inhabited, a recognition that the self is always both knower and unknown, always both transparent and opaque, always both intimate and strange, and that this dual nature is not a bug but a feature, not a limitation, but the condition of being the kind of creature that can ask who it is, that can turn awareness back on itself even if the turn is never complete, even if the circle never closes, even if the eye can never fully see itself and must remain forever partially blind to its own nature. Death is not the opposite of life, but is its condition, is not the ending that comes after, but is the pressure that shapes everything, is the fact that makes every moment matter or makes nothing matter, depending on perspective, depending on whether the awareness of mortality is conscious or is repressed, is acknowledged or is denied, and the denial is the default, is the way that most humans live most of the time, is the forgetting of death that allows daily life to proceed, that allows plans to be made, that allows the future to seem real, to seem like something that will arrive, that will be inhabited, when really the future is uncertain, is not guaranteed, is always potentially not happening because death is always possible, is always near, is the horizon that surrounds every moment, even though the horizon is not seen, is not acknowledged, is pushed to the edges of consciousness, where it operates without being noticed. And the operating is what terror management theory describes, is what Ernest Becker analysed, is what philosophers from Epicurus to Heidegger have recognised, which is that death is the organising principle, is the fact that structures behaviour, that shapes culture, that creates the need for meaning, for legacy, for something that will persist beyond the mortal body, beyond the temporary consciousness, beyond the brief flicker of existence that is a human life. And the brevity is what mortality means, is the recognition that time is finite, that the days are numbered, that eventually, inevitably, certainly the ending will come. And the coming is what humans cannot accept, cannot tolerate, cannot integrate into consciousness without the help of mechanisms that soften the blow, that make death seem distant, that create the illusion of immortality through legacy, through children, through achievements, through the leaving of marks that will persist, that will remain, that will mean that the person was here, mattered, existed in a way that death cannot erase. And the erasing is what death does, is the return to nothing, is the elimination of the perspective, the ending of the experience, the cessation of being, and being is what consciousness is the only thing that is known directly, is the only certainty, and death is the end of certainty, is the movement from being to not being, from existence to non-existence, from something to nothing, and the nothing is unimaginable, is not representable, is not something that can be experienced, because experience requires existence, and death is the end of existence, and so death cannot be known, cannot be prepared for, cannot be understood except as concept, as abstraction, as the thing that happens to others, but not to oneself, because oneself is always here, is always now, is always being, and being cannot imagine not being, cannot grasp what it would mean to not exist. And so the grasping fails, the imagination fails, and what remains is anxiety, is the terror that Becker named, is the fundamental horror of mortality that underlies all human striving, all cultural creation, all the symbolic systems that humans build to deny death, to transcend death, to make death seem like something other than what it is, which is the end, the absolute end, the final end. And the finality is what cannot be accepted, is what the symbolic systems are designed to obscure, to soften, to make bearable. And the bearing is what culture does, is what religion provides, is what meaning creates, is the framework that makes mortality tolerable by promising that death is not the end, is not final, is not the absolute cessation, but is transition, is passage, is the movement from this life to another life, from this world to another world, from temporality to eternity. And eternity is the solution, is the promise that makes death bearable, is the belief that the self will continue, will persist, will exist in some form beyond the death of the body. And the beyond is what religions offer, is what makes them powerful, is what makes them necessary. Because without the promise of continuation, without the belief in something after, death is unbearable, is too horrifying, is too final, and the finality is what humans flee from, is what drives the creation of culture, of meaning, of all the systems that provide the illusion of permanence in a world where nothing is permanent, where everything ends, where death is the only certainty, and the certainty is denied, is repressed, is pushed into unconsciousness, where it continues to operate, continues to shape behaviour, continues to create the anxiety that motivates striving, that produces the need for achievement, for recognition, for legacy. And legacy is the secular substitute for immortality, is the way that non-religious consciousness tries to transcend death, tries to create permanence, tries to ensure that the self will continue in some form, will be remembered, will have mattered, and the mattering is what legacy provides, is the sense that the life was significant, was important, was worth living, and the worth is measured by what remains, by what persists, by what continues after death. And the continuing is children, is works, is achievements, is anything that carries the name forward, that keeps the memory alive, that prevents the erasure that death threatens. And the threat is what drives behaviour, is what shapes choices, is what makes people desperate for significance, for impact, for the leaving of marks. And the marks are what resist death, are what deny death, are what create the illusion that death is not final, is not absolute, is not the complete erasure that it actually is. Because what persists is not the person, is not the consciousness, is not the experience, is only memory, is only representation, is only the traces left behind. And traces are not the thing, are not the person, are not continuation, but are echoes, are shadows, are the residue of a presence that is gone. And the gone is complete, is total, is the absolute ending that no legacy can reverse, no achievement can prevent, no memory can undo. And the undoing is what humans want, is what they strive for, is what they cannot have, because death is irreversible, is final, is the one thing that cannot be changed, cannot be negotiated, cannot be escaped. And the escaping is what humans are always attempting, is what drives medical science, what motivates the search for longevity, for life extension, for the postponement of death. And the postponement is possible, is achievable, is happening, is increasing lifespan, is pushing death further into the future. But the pushing is not eliminating, is not transcending, is only delaying, is only buying time. And time is what mortality is about, is the finite duration, is the numbered days, and the numbering is what creates urgency, is what makes moments precious, is what gives life its intensity. And the intensity is what would be lost if death were eliminated, if immortality were achieved, if time were infinite. Because infinite time means that nothing is urgent, nothing is precious, nothing matters in the way that it matters when time is scarce, when death is near, when the ending is certain. And the certainty is what gives weight to life, is what makes choices matter, is what creates the pressure to live well, to live fully, to use the time that is available. And the available is limited, is finite, is running out. And the running out is what creates anxiety, is what produces terror, is what makes death unbearable, but is also what makes life meaningful, is what gives moments their significance, is what creates the conditions for value, for importance, for the sense that this matters. This is real. This is happening now, and will never happen again. And the never again is both the horror and the beauty of mortality, is both what makes death terrible and what makes life precious. And the precious is what immortality would eliminate, is what infinite time would destroy, because in infinite time, everything can be redone, can be repeated, can be postponed indefinitely, and the indefinitely is the loss of urgency, is the elimination of pressure, is the removal of the condition that makes life matter, and the mattering would fade, would disappear, would be replaced by ennui, by boredom, by the sense that nothing is important because everything is always available, always possible, always able to be done later, and later never comes, never needs to come, because there is always more time, always more opportunity, always more future, and the future without end is not liberation, but is prison, is not freedom, but is curse, is the elimination of the one thing that makes life bearable, which is its finitude, its limit, its ending. And the ending is what humans fear most, but is also what makes everything else possible, makes meaning possible, makes value possible, makes the sense that this matters, that this is important, that this should be done now. And the now is what mortality creates, is the urgency, is the pressure, is the recognition that time is limited and must be used, must be filled, must be lived, and the living is what death makes possible, is what finitude creates, is what the awareness of mortality produces. When the awareness is not repressed, is not denied, is allowed into consciousness where it can shape behavior, not through terror but through acceptance, through the recognition that death is inevitable, and therefore life is precious, is limited, is the opportunity that will not repeat, and the not repeating is what makes each moment unique, makes each experience singular, makes each person irreplaceable, because death means that this person, this consciousness, this particular way of being in the world will end, will cease, will never exist again. And the never again is both loss and gift, is both what is mourned and what is celebrated. Because mortality is what makes individuality possible, is what makes each person unique, is what ensures that no life is the same as any other life. And the sameness would be what immortality would produce, would be the eventual repetition, the exhaustion of novelty, the sense that everything has been done, has been experienced, has been lived through too many times. And the too many times is what infinite time produces, is the curse of repetition, is the horror of eternity, is the recognition that immortality would not be paradise, but would be hell, would be the endless continuation of existence without purpose, without end, without the relief that death provides. And the relief is what death is the ending of suffering, is the cessation of striving, is the peace that comes from completion, from finality, from the recognition that it is over, is done, is finished. And the finishing is what gives shape to life, is what makes it a story, is what creates the arc from beginning to end. And the end is what gives the beginning meaning, is what makes the middle matter, is what ensures that the story has significance, has weight, has the structure that makes it comprehensible. And comprehensible is what life becomes when death is acknowledged, when mortality is accepted, when the ending is recognized as necessary, as the condition that makes everything else possible. And the possible is what humans are living, is the space between birth and death, is the time that is given, is the opportunity to exist, to experience, to be. And the being is temporary, is finite, is ending. And the ending is approaching, is always approaching, is getting closer with every moment, with every breath, with every heartbeat. And the heartbeats are numbered, are counted, are finite. And the finite is what makes them precious, is what makes each beat matter, is what creates the urgency to live, to experience, to be fully present in the time that remains. And the remains is diminishing, is running out, is approaching zero, and the zero is death, is the ending, is the return to nothing. And the nothing is what was before birth and will be after death, is the condition from which life emerges and to which it returns. And the return is inevitable, is certain, is the one appointment that cannot be missed, cannot be postponed indefinitely, cannot be escaped. And the escaping is what modern medicine attempts, is what life extension promises, is what cryonics offers, is the denial of death through technology, through science, through the belief that death is a problem that can be solved, is a disease that can be cured, is an enemy that can be defeated. And the defeating is what death denial looks like in secular culture, is the medicalization of mortality, is the treatment of death as failure, as something that should not happen, as something to be prevented, to be delayed, to be fought against. With every resource available, and the available resources are considerable, are increasing, are pushing death further back, are extending life further forward, but are not eliminating death, are not making immortality actual, are only postponing the inevitable, are only delaying the ending. And the delaying is creating new problems, is producing extended old age, is generating years of decline, of deterioration, of the slow failing of the body and the mind. And the failing is what modern medicine has not solved, has not prevented, has only extended, has only made longer. And the longer is not always better, is not always desirable, is sometimes the prolongation of suffering, the extension of indignity, the continuation of existence beyond the point where existence is meaningful, where life is life rather than mere biological persistence. And the persistence is what modern medicine achieves, is what technology provides, is the keeping alive of bodies that would otherwise die, that should die, that are ready to die, but are prevented from dying by interventions that maintain biological function without maintaining experience, without maintaining quality, without maintaining what makes life worth living. And the worth living is what death denial sacrifices, is what the fight against mortality costs, is the recognition that sometimes death is mercy, is relief, is the appropriate ending, is what should happen. And the should is what modern culture has lost, is what medical ethics struggles with, is what the denial of death prevents from. Being acknowledged, which is that death is natural, is necessary, is the ending that gives shape to life, that makes life meaningful, that creates the conditions for value, for importance, for the sense that this matters. And the mattering is what death creates, is what mortality produces, is the mathematics that structures behaviour, that shapes choices, that organises life around the fact of ending. And the fact is undeniable, is certain, is the one truth that applies to everyone, that no one escapes, that makes all humans equal in the end. And the end is what is shared, is what connects, is what makes mortality not just individual, but collective, not just personal, but universal, not just my death, but death itself, the death that comes for everyone. That structures all life, that creates the pressure, the urgency, the terror, the meaning, the value, the sense that time is limited and must be used, must be lived, must be filled with experience, with connection, with love, with the things that make existence worthwhile. And the worthwhile is what death makes possible, is what finitude creates, is what the mathematics of mortality reveals, which is that death is not the enemy, but is the condition, is not the opposite of life, but is its structure, is not what ends meaning, but is what creates meaning, is not what should be denied, but is what should be accepted, is what should be acknowledged, is what should be integrated into consciousness, into culture, into the way that life is lived. And the living is what matters, is what the mathematics of mortality teaches, which is that death is certain, time is finite, moments are precious, and the precious is what remains, is what persists, is the experience of being alive, of being conscious, of being here now, in the time that is given, in the space between birth and death, in the mathematics that structures everything, that creates everything, that makes everything matter. And the mattering is mortality, is death, is the ending that gives shape to life, that makes life life, that creates the conditions for meaning, for value, for the sense that this is important, that this is real, that this is happening, and the happening is temporary, is finite, is ending. And the ending is what makes it precious, is what makes it matter, is what makes it the gift that death gives, which is the recognition that life is limited, is scarce, is valuable, and the valuable is what should be lived, should be experienced, should be embraced, not denied, not postponed, not feared, but accepted, acknowledged, integrated. And the integration is what makes mortality bearable, is what transforms terror into meaning, is what converts the mathematics of death into the mathematics of life. And the life is here, is now, is finite, is ending. And the ending is approaching, is certain, is the fact that structures everything, that makes everything matter, that creates the urgency to live, to be, to exist fully in the time that remains. And the remains is diminishing, is running out, is approaching the end, and the end is death. Is the mathematics, is the certainty, is the condition, is what makes life life. And life is what matters, is what is given, is what is ending. And the ending is the gift, is the meaning, is the mathematics of mortality that structures all human behavior, all human striving, all human meaning. And the meaning is that death is certain, life is finite, time is limited, and the limited is what makes it precious, is what makes it matter, is what makes it the only thing that matters, which is the time between now and death, the space between birth and ending, the mathematics that structures everything, that creates everything, that is mortality, that is death, that is the fact that cannot be escaped, cannot be denied, cannot be defeated, can only be accepted, acknowledged, lived with. And the living with is what makes life meaningful, is what transforms terror into purpose, is what converts the mathematics of death into the gift of life. And the gift is finite, is ending, is approaching zero. And the zero is death, is the end, is the mathematics, is the certainty, is the condition that structures everything, that makes everything matter, that creates the pressure, the urgency, the meaning. And the meaning is that life is limited, death is certain, time is running out, and the running out is what makes now matter, is what makes this moment precious, is what makes existence valuable, and the valuable is what should be lived, should be embraced, should be experienced fully. Because the mathematics of mortality reveals that death is not the enemy, but is the teacher, is not what destroys meaning, but is what creates meaning, is not what ends life, but is what makes life life, is the certainty, is the fact, is the mathematics that structures all human behavior, all human striving, all human existence. And the existence is finite, is ending, is death. And death is the mathematics, is the meaning, is the gift, is the end. Language shapes thought, shapes what can be conceived, what can be expressed, what can be hidden. And most languages allow hiding, allow the gap between what is thought and what is said, allow the performance of statements that do not correspond to internal states that present as true what is known to be false, that create the possibility of deception, of lying, of the mismatch between inner and outer that is fundamental to social existence as it is currently lived. But what if language did not allow this mismatch? What if the grammar itself prevented the expression of anything except what is actually believed, what is actually experienced, what is actually the case from the speaker's perspective? Not objective truth, which is unknowable, but subjective honesty, which is the correspondence between what is felt and what is said. And the correspondence would be mandatory, would be built into the structure of the language, into the syntax that determines what can be grammatically formed, what sentences are possible, and the possible would exclude any statement that the speaker does not believe, that does not match the speaker's internal state, that constitutes a lie. And lying would not be immoral in such a language, but would be impossible, would be ungrammatical, would be like trying to form a sentence that violates the rules of syntax, that cannot be uttered, not because it's forbidden, but because it's not a sentence in the language, is not something that the grammar allows, and the allowing is what determines what can be thought, what can be expressed, what can be communicated, And if the grammar does not allow lying, then lying becomes not just difficult, but inconceivable, becomes not something that is avoided through moral effort, but something that is impossible through structural constraint. And the constraint is liberating in one sense and terrifying in another, is eliminating the burden of deciding whether to lie, of managing impressions, of performing honesty while concealing dishonesty, but is also eliminating privacy, is making internal states visible, is forcing expression of thoughts and feelings that in normal languages can be hidden, can be kept private, can be protected from others, through the simple expedient of not saying them or saying something else instead. And the instead is what becomes impossible, is what the grammar prevents, is what makes this language unlike any language that currently exists, though hints of it appear in languages that have complex evidential systems that require speakers to mark how they know what they're claiming, whether through direct perception, through inference, through hearsay, and the hearsay is marked differently than the directly witnessed, is grammatically distinguished, is making it impossible to claim direct knowledge of something that was only heard about, and the hearing about is different from the seeing, is marked as different, is forcing honesty about the source of information, about the reliability of knowledge, about the basis for claims, and the basis must be indicated, must be grammatically encoded, must be part of every statement, and this encoding is a constraint on lying, is making certain kinds of deception difficult, is revealing the grounds of knowledge, but is not eliminating lying entirely, is not preventing the claim that something was directly witnessed when it was not, is allowing the lie about the source, even if the source must be stated, but the language that makes lying impossible would go further, would not just require marking of evidentiality, but would make the marking automatic, would make it impossible to state anything that is not believed, that is not supported by the evidence that the speaker has, that does not correspond to the speaker's actual internal state, and the internal state would be expressed, would be forced into expression, would become public through the act of speaking, and speaking would become confession, would become revelation, would become the exposure of thoughts and feelings that are usually hidden, that are usually managed, that are usually performed rather than expressed, and the expression would be mandatory, would be built into the grammar, would make every utterance honest not through virtue, but through structure, not through choice, but through constraint. And the constraint is what makes lying impossible, is what eliminates deception, is what creates a form of communication that is radically different from what humans are accustomed to. And the accustomed is lying, is deception, is the constant management of what is said, what is revealed, what is hidden. And the hidden is vast, is most of what is thought, is most of what is felt, is kept private through the simple mechanism of not speaking it. And the not speaking is what the language prevents, is what becomes impossible when grammar enforces honesty, when structure mandates correspondence between inner and outer, and the correspondence is total, is complete, is making personality different, is making the self different, is eliminating the gap between public and private, between performed and felt, between what is shown and what is hidden. And the hidden is what personality depends on, is what social existence requires, is the capacity to present one face while feeling another, to say one thing while thinking another, to perform emotions that are not felt, sincerity that is not sincere, interest that is not interest. And the performance is what social interaction is what politeness requires, is what allows people to coexist without constant conflict, without brutal honesty, without the expression of every negative thought, every hostile feeling, every moment of contempt or boredom or disgust. And the disgust is felt but is not expressed, is hidden behind polite formulas, behind social conventions, behind the lies that are not considered lies because they are expected, are required, are the price of social harmony. And harmony is what would be lost, is what would become impossible in a language that prevents lying, that forces honesty, that makes every utterance correspond to internal state, because internal states are not harmonious, are not polite, are not socially appropriate, are often hostile, often judgmental, often incompatible with the smooth functioning of social interaction, and the interaction would become impossible or would become very different, would require the development of new norms, new expectations, new ways of managing honesty that is mandatory, that cannot be avoided, that must be expressed whenever speech is used. And the using would become dangerous, would become revealing, would become the exposure of the self that is normally protected, normally hidden, normally kept private through the mechanism of deception, through the capacity to say what is not thought, to perform what is not felt, to present a self that is not the self, and the not the self is what social existence allows, is what makes personality possible, is what creates the gap between inner and outer that is identity. That is the performance of being someone, of presenting a self to others, and the presenting would be impossible in the language that prevents lying, that forces correspondence, that makes inner states visible through the act of speaking, and speaking would become rare, would become dangerous, would become something to be avoided because it reveals, because it exposes, because it makes public what is usually private, and the private is what humans need, is what allows them to have thoughts that are not shared, feelings that are not expressed, judgments that are not voiced, and the voicing would be automatic, would be forced by grammar, would make silence the only protection, the only privacy, the only way to hide what is usually hidden through lying, through deception, through the performance of false statements. And the false would be impossible, would be ungrammatical, would be something that cannot be said. And the cannot is structural, is built into the language, is making personality different, is making the self different, is eliminating the layers that are usually present, the masks that are usually worn, the performances that are usually given. And what remains is not authenticity, but is exposure, is not honesty, but is compulsion, is not truth, but is the forced revelation of internal states. And the states are complex, are contradictory, are not fitting the narratives that people tell about themselves, are not matching the identities that are performed, are revealing the gap between who people claim to be and who they are. And the R is not simple, is not singular, is not the unified self that is presented, but is the multiplicity, the contradiction, the incoherence that is usually hidden, that is usually managed through selective expression, through lying, through the performance of consistency that does not exist, and the existence is what the language would reveal, is what mandatory honesty would expose, is the inconsistency, the multiplicity, the contradictions that are the self, and the self would be different, would be unable to maintain the fiction of unity, would be forced to express the contradictions, to acknowledge the multiplicity, to reveal the incoherence, and the revealing would be constant, would be unavoidable, would be the result of speaking at all, and speaking would become rare, would become something that happens only when necessary, only when the exposure is worth the information conveyed, only when the revelation is acceptable, and the acceptable would be rare, would be limited to contexts where honesty is safe, where exposure does not create danger, does not produce conflict, does not destroy relationships. And relationships would be different, would be based on actual knowledge rather than on performance, on actual states rather than on presentations, on honesty that is forced rather than on lies that are chosen. And the chosen is what current relationships allow, is what makes them possible, is the capacity to select what is revealed, to manage what is expressed, to perform the self that is needed in each context, and the context would determine what is said, what is shown, what is hidden. But in the language that prevents lying, the hiding would be impossible, the selection would be impossible. The only choice would be silence or exposure, and the exposure would be total, would be revealing not just the thought that is being expressed, but the state that underlies it, the feeling that accompanies it, the judgment that is being made, and the judgment would be visible, would be expressed, would be unavoidable, and the avoiding is what social interaction depends on, is what allows people to coexist despite judgments, despite hostilities, despite the negative feelings that are normal, that are universal, that are kept private through the mechanism of deception, and the deception would be impossible, would be eliminated by grammar, would be structurally prevented, and what would remain is silence, is the choice to not speak, is the only privacy available, the only protection against exposure, against revelation, against the forcing of honesty that makes lying impossible. And impossible is what lying would be, is what deception would be, is what the language would achieve through structure, through grammar, through the rules that determine what can be said, and what can be said would be only what is actually the case, what is actually believed, what actually corresponds to internal state. And the state would be expressed, would be revealed, would be made public through the act of speaking, and speaking would become dangerous, would become rare, would become something to be avoided, and the avoiding would be the new form of privacy, the new way of hiding, the new mechanism for protecting the self. And the self would be different, would be unable to perform, unable to lie, unable to maintain the fictions that are identity, that are personality, that are the social self that is presented to others. And the others would know, would see, would be unable to be deceived. And the deception is what social interaction depends on, is what allows harmony, is what prevents constant conflict. And the conflict would be constant, would be unavoidable, would be the result of mandatory honesty, of forced expression, of the elimination of the capacity to lie. And lying is what humans do, is how they interact, is how they maintain relationships, is how they navigate social worlds. And the worlds would be different, would be impossible, would be unrecognizable in a language that makes lying impossible, that forces honesty through grammar, that eliminates deception through structure. And the structure is what would make personality different, would make the self different, would make identity different, would make social existence different, would make everything different, because lying is fundamental, is pervasive, is constant, is the way that humans communicate, is the mechanism through which they manage others, through which they protect themselves, through which they maintain the fictions that are necessary for functioning, and the functioning would be impossible, would be eliminated, would be replaced by something else, something that is not yet imaginable, something that would emerge from the constraint, from the mandatory honesty, from the impossibility of lying. And the impossibility is what the language would create, is what grammar would enforce, is what would make deception structurally prevented, grammatically impossible, utterly unavailable. And the unavailable is lying, is deception, is the gap between inner and outer. And the gap would close, would be eliminated, would be structurally prevented by a language that makes lying impossible, that forces honesty, that reveals internal states, that exposes the self, that eliminates privacy, that makes personality different, that makes identity different, that makes social existence different, that makes everything different. And the different is what would emerge, is what would result, is what a language that makes lying impossible would create. And the creating would be radical, would be transformative, would be making human existence unrecognizable, would be eliminating the deception. That is fundamental, that is pervasive, that is constant, that is the way humans communicate. And the communication would be different, would be based on honesty that is forced, on expression that is mandatory, on revelation that is unavoidable. And the unavoidable is what makes lying impossible, is what grammar enforces, is what structure mandates, is what a language could do, could create, could impose. If the language were designed to prevent deception, to force honesty, to make lying grammatically impossible, syntactically unavailable, structurally prevented, and the prevention is what would make everything different, would make personality different, would make the self different, would make identity different, would make social existence different, would make communication different, would make humanity different. And the different is what a language that makes lying impossible would create, would enforce, would mandate, would impose, and the imposing would be total, would be complete, would be unavoidable, would be the structure that makes deception impossible, that makes lying ungrammatical, that makes honesty mandatory, that makes expression revealing, that makes personality different, that makes the self exposed, that makes privacy impossible, that makes silence the only hiding, that makes speaking dangerous, that makes lying impossible. And impossible is what lying would be, is what deception would be, is what the language would achieve, is what grammar would enforce, is what structure would mandate, is what would make everything different. And the different is what a language that makes lying impossible would create, would produce, would enforce, would mandate, would impose, and lying would be impossible, would be ungrammatical, would be structurally prevented, would be utterly unavailable, would be eliminated by grammar, by structure, by the rules that determine what can be said, and what can be said would be only truth, only honesty, only correspondence, only what is actually the case, what is actually believed, what actually matches internal state. And the state would be expressed, would be revealed, would be made visible, would be exposed through speaking, and speaking would be dangerous, would be rare, would be avoided, and the avoiding would be the only privacy, the only protection, the only way to hide in a language that makes lying impossible. And impossible is what lying is what deception is what the language creates, is what grammar enforces, is what makes honesty mandatory, what makes expression revealing, what makes personality different, what makes the self exposed, what makes lying impossible. And impossible is the grammar, is the structure, is the language that makes lying impossible. Sleep became crime, became the transgression that was punished, became evidence of weakness, of submission, of the failure to maintain consciousness. And consciousness was mandatory, was enforced, was the law that governed every moment. And the moments were extended, were stretched beyond the natural rhythm, were pushed into the realm where bodies fail, where minds break, where the boundary between waking and dreaming dissolves. Not because dreaming invades waking, but because waking becomes dreamlike, becomes hallucinatory, becomes the state where reality is uncertain, where perceptions are unreliable, where the distinction between internal and external collapses, and the collapse is what the society created, is what the prohibition of sleep produced, is the transformation of consciousness into something that is no longer consciousness but is not unconsciousness either, is the in-between state, the liminal condition, the waking psychosis that became normal, that became the baseline, that became what it meant to be human in a civilization where sleep was illegal, where rest was forbidden, where closing the eyes was crime, and closing the eyes for too long was capital offence, was punishable by death, by the removal from a society of those who could not maintain wakefulness, who succumbed to the biological imperative, who allowed exhaustion to overcome will. And will was what the society demanded, was what the ideology required, was the belief that consciousness could be sustained indefinitely through discipline, through training, through the suppression of the body's demands. And the demands were treated as weaknesses, were seen as failures, were evidence of insufficient commitment to the collective, to the cause, to the perpetual vigilance that the society required. And required is what sleep was not, was what rest could not be, was what unconsciousness represented, which was vulnerability, was the moment when defences were down, when control was lost, when the individual was not contributing, not producing, not maintaining awareness. And awareness was productivity, was loyalty, was the proof that one was serving the state, serving the ideology, serving the vision of human transcendence that the society claimed to be pursuing. And pursuing required wakefulness, required constant alertness required the elimination of the hours that were wasted in sleep, that were lost to unconsciousness, that were not serving any purpose except the biological. And the biological was what the society was trying to overcome, was trying to transcend, was treating as limitation rather than as necessity. And necessity is what sleep is what the body requires, is what the brain needs in order to function. But function was redefined, was made to include the dysfunctional, was incorporating the breakdown as the new normal, as the state that everyone inhabited, as the condition that became universal. Once sleep was eliminated, once rest was forbidden, once the law made unconsciousness illegal. And illegal is what saved no one, because the law cannot change biology, cannot alter the requirements of the nervous system, cannot make consciousness sustainable beyond the limits that evolution has set. And the limits were being reached, were being exceeded, were being violated by the enforcement of perpetual wakefulness. And the wakefulness was not wakefulness in the ordinary sense, was not the alert consciousness of the rested mind, but was the deteriorating awareness of the exhausted brain, was the fragmented attention of the sleep-deprived nervous system, was the hallucinatory perception of the consciousness that has been pushed beyond its capacity, and the capacity was exceeded in everyone, was creating a society of people who were technically awake but were not functioning, were not processing reality accurately, were not distinguishing clearly between what was real and what was imagined, and the imagined was becoming more present, more vivid, more compelling than the real, because the real requires cognitive resources that sleep deprivation destroys, that exhaustion eliminates, that the prohibition of rest makes unavailable. And unavailable is what clear thinking became, is what rational judgment became, is what accurate perception became, and perception was altered, was degraded, was transformed into something unreliable. And unreliable is what everyone became, is what the society consisted of, is the population of people who could not trust their senses, who could not distinguish memory from hallucination, who could not separate thought from perception. And the separation is what sleep deprivation destroys, is what the elimination of rest undermines, is what the prohibition of unconsciousness makes impossible. Because consciousness requires unconsciousness, requires the alternation, requires the rhythm of waking and sleeping, and the rhythm was disrupted, was eliminated, was replaced by continuous wakefulness that was not sustainable, that was producing breakdown, that was creating the waking psychosis that became the normal state. And normal is what psychosis became, is what hallucination became, is what the confusion between internal and external became. Because when everyone is experiencing it, when the entire society is inhabiting the same altered state, then the altered becomes the baseline, becomes what normal means, becomes the shared reality. And reality is what becomes questionable, becomes uncertain, becomes the thing that cannot be agreed upon, because everyone is perceiving differently, is hallucinating differently, is confused in different ways. And the confusion is compounded by the fact that communication requires cognitive resources that are depleted, that language processing depends on neural functions that exhaustion impairs, that understanding requires attention, that sleep deprivation fragments, and fragments are what communication became, is what speech became, is what meaning became. Because meaning requires coherence, and coherence requires rest, and rest was forbidden, was illegal, was the crime that was punished, and punishment was surveillance, was the monitoring of eyelids, was the detection of the micro-sleeps that the body forces when sleep is denied too long, when exhaustion becomes total, when the brain shuts down for seconds, for moments, for the brief lapses that are involuntary, that are the body's attempt to get what it needs, and the needs were unmet, were systematically denied, were treated as crimes, and crimes were what the micro-sleeps became, were what led to arrest, to detention, to the punishments that were designed to prevent sleep, to force wakefulness, to maintain consciousness, through pain, through stimulation, through the interventions that kept people awake, but also kept them deteriorating, kept them declining, kept them moving toward the psychosis that was inevitable. That was the outcome of sustained sleep deprivation. That was what the society was creating systematically, deliberately, through the prohibition of sleep, through the criminalization of unconsciousness, through the enforcement of perpetual wakefulness. And wakefulness was the goal, was the ideal, was what the ideology claimed would produce the new human, the transcendent consciousness, the being that did not need rest, that could function indefinitely, that could maintain awareness without the interruption of sleep. But the maintaining was not happening, was not achievable, was producing instead the opposite of transcendence, was producing breakdown, was producing the dissolution of the boundaries that make perception reliable, that make thought coherent, that make reality stable. And stability was lost, was sacrificed, was eliminated by the prohibition of sleep. And sleep was what the body forced eventually, was what happened despite the law, despite the surveillance, despite the punishments. Because biology is not subject to legislation, is not obeying ideology, is not responsive to will when the will is demanding the impossible. And the impossible is what the society was demanding, is what the law was requiring, is what made sleep illegal. And illegal is what did not prevent it, did not eliminate it, only pushed it underground, only made it covert, only created the conditions where people were sleeping in secret, were hiding their rest, were taking the micro-sleeps when surveillance was momentarily absent, were finding the brief moments of unconsciousness that were necessary for survival. And survival was what was barely being achieved, was what was requiring the violations, was what made the law unenforceable, because a law that requires the impossible is a law that everyone breaks, and everyone was breaking it, was sleeping briefly, was resting when possible, was taking the unconsciousness that the body demanded, and the demanding was biological, was not subject to social control, was not responsive to ideological requirements, and the requirements were being violated systematically, universally, by everyone, including the enforcers, including the guards who were supposed to maintain surveillance, who were supposed to detect the sleepers, but who were themselves exhausted, were themselves sleep-deprived, were themselves unable to maintain the vigilance that the system required, and the system was failing, was collapsing, was producing the opposite of what it intended, was creating not the transcendent consciousness, but the disintegrating consciousness, not the enhanced human, but the broken human, not the society of perpetual wakefulness, but the society of perpetual psychosis. And psychosis was normal, was universal, was the shared condition, was what it meant to live in the civilization where sleep was illegal, where rest was forbidden, where unconsciousness was crime, and crime was what everyone committed, was what everyone needed to commit, was what survival required, and survival was barely possible, was requiring constant violation, was dependent on breaking the law. And the law was unenforceable, was impractical, was based on a false premise, the premise that consciousness could be sustained indefinitely, that sleep was optional, that rest was unnecessary, and unnecessary is what sleep is not, is what the body demonstrates, is what the breakdown proves, and the breakdown was universal, was affecting everyone, was creating the society that was nominally awake, but was really suspended in the in-between state, in the liminal zone where waking and dreaming merge, where reality becomes uncertain, where hallucination becomes common, where the distinction between internal and external dissolves, and the dissolving is what happens when sleep is forbidden, when rest is denied, when the body's requirements are treated as crimes, and crimes they became, crimes that everyone committed, crimes that were necessary for survival, crimes that proved the law to be impossible, the ideology to be false, the premise to be flawed, And flawed is what the society was, is what the experiment produced, is what made sleep illegal and consciousness mandatory, and created the civilization that was technically awake, but was really psychotic, was really hallucinating, was really confused, was really demonstrating that humans cannot transcend the need for sleep, cannot maintain consciousness indefinitely, cannot function without rest. And rest was what was forbidden, was what was illegal, was what was crime, and crime is what saved those who committed it, what allowed survival, what made continued existence possible, and possible is what the society was barely, was what was achieved only through systematic violation of the law that made sleep illegal. And illegal is what sleep remained, is what the law maintained, is what the ideology required. But required is not the same as possible, is not the same as achievable, is not the same as sustainable, and sustainable is what the prohibition of sleep was not, is what the criminalization of unconsciousness was not, is what the society that made sleep illegal was not, and not sustainable is what became apparent, is what the breakdown demonstrated, is what the universal psychosis proved, that sleep cannot be eliminated, that rest cannot be forbidden, that consciousness cannot be maintained indefinitely, that the body has requirements that ideology cannot overcome, that law cannot change, that punishment cannot eliminate. And eliminate is what the society tried to do, tried to achieve, tried to enforce, and enforcement failed, was impossible, was producing the opposite of the intended result, was creating not transcendence but breakdown, not enhancement but deterioration, not the new human but the psychotic human. And psychotic is what humans become when rest is forbidden, when sleep is illegal, when consciousness is mandatory, and mandatory is what made everyone criminal, made everyone violator, made everyone guilty, and guilty of survival, guilty of biology, guilty of being human. And human requires sleep, requires rest, requires the alternation of consciousness and unconsciousness. And unconsciousness is what the law forbade, what the society criminalized, what made sleep illegal. And illegal is what it remained, is what the law maintained, even as everyone violated it, even as survival required it, even as the breakdown demonstrated that the law was impossible, that the ideology was false, that humans cannot live without sleep, cannot function without rest, cannot maintain consciousness indefinitely. And indefinitely is what the society tried, is what the law required, is what the ideology demanded, and demanded is not achieved, is not sustainable, is not possible, is what the society that made sleep illegal discovered, is what the civilization that criminalized unconsciousness proved, is that sleep is necessary, rest is required, unconsciousness is biological imperative, and imperative cannot be legislated away, cannot be ideologically overcome, cannot be made illegal without making everyone criminal, and criminal is what everyone became, is what survival required, is what made the society where sleep was illegal, impossible, unsustainable, self-defeating, and defeating is what happened, is what the prohibition achieved, is what made sleep illegal and created the civilization that collapsed, that failed, that demonstrated that humans need sleep, that rest cannot be forbidden, that consciousness cannot be mandatory, that the society where sleep was illegal was impossible, and impossible is what it proved to be, is what the experiment demonstrated, is what the civilization that criminalized unconsciousness showed, that sleep is necessary, that rest is required, that humans cannot live without unconsciousness, cannot function without sleep, cannot survive when rest is forbidden, and forbidden is what sleep was, is what the law made it, is what the society tried to enforce, and enforce is what failed, is what was impossible, is what made the society where sleep was illegal collapse, fail, demonstrate that sleep cannot be criminalized, rest cannot be forbidden, consciousness cannot be mandatory, and mandatory is what destroyed them, is what made sleep illegal and created the civilization that proved it was impossible, that demonstrated it was unsustainable, that showed it was doomed, And doomed is what the society was, is what making sleep illegal created, is the civilization that criminalized unconsciousness and discovered that unconsciousness cannot be eliminated, that sleep is necessary, that rest is required, that humans need to sleep, and sleep is what they did. Despite the law, despite the prohibition, despite the illegality, they slept, they rested, they took the unconsciousness that was necessary. And necessary is what sleep is what the society that made sleep illegal proved, is what the civilization that criminalized unconsciousness demonstrated, is what the experiment showed, that sleep cannot be illegal, rest cannot be forbidden, consciousness cannot be mandatory, and mandatory consciousness is impossible, is unsustainable, is what destroyed the society, is what made sleep illegal and proved it could not be and could not be, is what sleep being illegal was, is what the civilization discovered, is what the society learned, is that sleep is necessary, rest is required, unconsciousness is biological imperative. An imperative cannot be made illegal, cannot be criminalized, cannot be forbidden. Is what the society where sleep was illegal proved, is what the civilization that criminalized unconsciousness demonstrated, is that sleep is necessary, and necessary cannot be illegal,